In addition to being able to actually create those vendor bills and post them over to QuickBooks, we also added the ability to import vendor bills from QuickBooks as well. So you can find that feature under QuickBooks, import data, and import expense history. So as this message states, billable expenses that were created in QuickBooks can now be imported into BigTime as well. Just be aware that we'll only import expenses that have been linked to an active BigTime client. And we won't re-import expenses that have already been imported, so you never have to worry about doubling up. Let's say if you imported for the same date range multiple times, BigTime will recognize that there were any expenses already imported, not to import those same expenses a second time. So let's hit next step in the bottom right. Here we can choose our date range. We can choose a single client to import expenses for. If we do that, we can select whatever date range we like. If we don't select a client, we can only select a month at a time. So we can import all expenses from October for all clients, or we can say, maybe all expenses for Simmons CPA for the entire year. You do need to choose a default expense code, and where that will come into play is if you import a vendor expense that's not linked to expense code that exists in BigTime, then the code that will be applied is whatever you choose here as the default expense code. Be aware, however, that if the default expense code you choose is not linked to a valid QuickBooks service item or expense account, then the line item in your post detail screen will be blank. So general rule of thumb is to just make sure whichever default value you choose here is properly linked in the My Company field values page in your list of expense codes. Choose fees other and we'll hit next step. Then we get one last chance to confirm our date range and also the client that we're importing for before we hit import in the bottom right. Then once we're done with that, we'll just get a message whether or not that import succeeded, how many expenses were imported in the period, and how many were skipped over. So if we wanted to maybe, let's say, just import everything from October, I did have some vendor expenses that I already imported. So here you can see the message that there were 4 entries that were skipped because they contained no new, so they were already imported, in other words. So just some general common reasons that a vendor bill would not import, so things to look out for. Number 1 reason would be that the vendor bill has already been imported BigTime, and once again, you'll get this notification letting you know if that's the case. That's why those were skipped over. Another reason could be that the vendor bill is not marked as billable in QuickBooks. If it's not marked as billable, then it will not import. It could also be that the vendor bill is already posted from BigTime to QuickBooks. So you cannot create a vendor bill in BigTime, post it to QuickBooks, and then import it back into BigTime. And finally, if you do have a vendor bill that doesn't have any projects that are linked QuickBooks projects, customers, jobs, whatever you might be calling them on your site, then we would skip those expenses, those vendor bills as well. So the imported vendor bill can be located in the post vendor bills screen that we looked at earlier. Here. You can also view those from the project's time and expense history, so whichever project you imported those bills under. On reports in the report center, and also in the WIP, so you can bill customers for those expenses. Just keep in mind that the expense will not be found in a staffer's expense history or expense reports, but that user that did import the vendor bill will be considered the submitted by user. So if you're running a report, you can include a field to show who imported that expense by including that submitted by field. Another note on vendor bills is the feature to enter vendor expenses does not need to be enabled to actually import expenses. So you can import expenses regardless of whether or not you're actually entering those vendor bills in BigTime. You can import a bill without a reference number, and that number would be auto-assigned. As I mentioned earlier, once again, you can only import a vendor bill within a 30-day date range if you're not specifying a project. So it would be any date range you want for a single project or one whole month for all projects. Also, a cool new feature that we've added in relation to importing expenses is the ability to have those imported expenses linked to a task. So if you import a vendor bill that is linked to a service item, that service item is linked to an expense code. If, for example, here we've got dues and subscriptions linked to dues and subscriptions, and there's a task on the project that you're importing that vendor bill into that's linked to the same service item, then the vendor bill will be applied against that task. So for budgeting purposes, that means you can import your vendor expenses and actually have them count against your task expense budgets.